Another school shooting, another gun control debate. U.S. President Joe Biden has renewed calls for restricting the sale of firearms after last week's Nashville shooting. Will the death of 6 people at the private Presbyterian school be a catalyst for change to U.S. gun laws, or will this debate continue indefinitely? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is U.S. gun control. Last week, another deadly school shooting in the U.S. killed 3 9-year-old children and 3 adults. The shooter was a 28-year-old former student of the Nashville Covenant School who came armed with 2 assault rifles and a handgun. Now, the shooting prompted the familiar cycle of condolences and calls to action, leading President Joe Biden to ask again for a ban on assault weapons. But even as Nashville residents grieved, a federal judge quietly cleared the way to drop the minimum age for Tennesseans to carry handguns publicly without a permit to 18 years old, scrapping a law from just 2 years earlier that set the age at 21. Let's take a look now at the extent of the issue in the U.S.
Gun control is one of the most divisive issues in the U.S. Republicans say any limit on bearing arms violates the Second Amendment. They believe the problem lies with mentally ill people and what they call cultural sickness. And as a result, the Democrats' call for an assault weapon ban and universal background checks keep stalling in Congress. But despite years of political debate, the numbers show addressing the problem has now become even more urgent. According to the Gun Violence Archive, the US has had 131 mass shootings this year alone, in which 4 or more people were killed or injured. In 2022, 647 mass shootings took place across the country. Some experts say the main problem is access to firearms. According to the Small Arms Survey, the US has more guns than people. The estimated number of civilian-held firearms per 100 residents is 120, by far the highest number in the world. And the public wants it to change. The latest Gallup poll shows 57% of Americans want stricter gun control, while only 10% think the country should ease the current regulation. After last week's shooting in Nashville, demonstrators urged Tennessee lawmakers to act. Despite these calls echoing with most Americans, little has been done. One reason for that is simply money. Gun rights lobbies, like the National Rifle Association, spend millions of dollars to push their agenda. Gun control groups blame the lobbyists for stalling federal and state legislation to restrict firearms. And for years, gun rights lobbyists have spent more than those that support greater regulation.
Now, most of us shudder when we remember one of America's deadliest shootings. 24 years ago, on April 20th, 1999, 2 students at Columbine High School in Colorado used an array of weapons to kill 13 people and injure 20 others. Since then, there have been 376 school shootings in the United States. After every shooting, there are mass protests and Congress debates gun laws, but an agreement is very rarely reached. The issue, which has become highly politicized, has seen frustration across the board. It reached boiling point last week for Democrat Jamal Bowman, who was once a school principal. He ripped into Republican Thomas Massie outside the chambers of Congress over the idea of teachers being armed in schools to prevent school shootings.
Talking about gun violence.
In a school that allows teachers to
carry guns? You think more guns lead to more death?
Would you co-sponsor?
More guns lead to more death.
Would you co-sponsor?
Look at the data. You're not looking at any data. You're carrying the water for the gun lobby.
No.
Look at the data. More guns lead to more deaths.
For the kids.
Guns, states that have open carry laws have more deaths.
In every school that allows
States that
carry,
have open
there's
carry
never been a
laws
shooting.
have more deaths.
There's never been a shooting.
Are you listening to what I'm saying?
Yeah, calm down.
Calm down. Children are dying.
I know. I've got
9-year-old children. Because the solution is not arming teachers. Have you ever worked in a school? Have you ever worked in you ever worked in a school?
Well, some debate that data and still insist more guns would make Americans safer. Joining me now to debate that and more are, from Missoula, Montana, John Lott. He's the president of the Crime Prevention Research Center and author of More Guns, Less Crime. From Chicago, we have Linton. He's Senior Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. And from Miami, Larry Barton, Professor of Crisis Management and Public Safety at the University of Central Florida. Thanks all so much for being with us. John, I'll begin with you because your research exclusively produces statistics that say restricting firearm sales does not reduce gun violence, and in fact, the opposite happens, according to your numbers. I don't want to get into the numbers, as everyone can actually view them online, so I'll ask you this. If the United States has more privately owned guns per capita than any other country really in the world, why does it also have more gun crime than any of its especially developed counterparts?
Well, if you look at other countries, there's countries like Israel and Switzerland that have higher gun possession rates than we have here in the United States. But if you look at murders and other things, the United States is below the average for countries around the world. If you look at these things like mass public shootings, there are many countries that have much higher per capita rates of mass public shootings than we have in the United States, including countries in Europe. What's happening, like the attack that just happened in Nashville, Tennessee, is that you have another attack in a place where guns were not allowed. There was no signs there warning attackers that that was a place where people might have concealed handguns to protect themselves. These murderers, time after time, if you read their diaries or manifestos, including the attacker this last week, according to the Nashville police chief, had looked at 2 other targets, but had decided to go after this one because they thought that there was security at those other places with armed people that would be able to stop the attack.
Yeah, John, it's amazing to me because there's always a reason why these attacks keep happening. Every time we discuss this with you, every specific case, there's another reason for this being a particular target. And basically, you're saying none of these laws that are being instituted would really protect people anyway, because there's always another reason for something going wrong. So in essence, only an all-out ban on guns would work. That would stop gun violence, would it not?
I mean, look, there are many places around the world that have either banned all guns or all handguns. Name me one place that's banned either all guns or all handguns that's seen murder rates go down or even stay the same. Every single time that those bans have been in place, murder rates have gone up, many times by large amounts. And what you have happen is that when you ban guns, and this is true for many different types of gun control regulations, they're more likely to be obeyed by law-abiding good citizens than they are criminals. You may take some guns away from criminals, but if you're primarily disarming law-abiding good citizens, you actually make it for criminals to go and commit crimes. And these gun-free zones, I mean, it's not a different reason for each one. You have about 94% of the mass public shootings that occur in the United States occur in those places where people aren't allowed to protect themselves. These attackers make some sense, but they're...
John, we recognize that the statistics you give are particularly from your research, which in the field of numbers on gun statistics usually tends to be an anomaly. I know that the New Yorker just wrote an article about 6 months ago called "Shaping the Gun Rights Debate." John Lott is the most influential pro-gun researcher in the country, but his methods and finding have been repeatedly debunked. So I know you say your studies are, you have the veracity when you give these numbers, but just to know that they are largely in debate. Alan, I can see you disagree with a lot of what you heard.
Please, since you bring up the New Yorker, people have to know that the reporter there, Michael Spies, was paid $150,000 by Bloomberg's gun control groups to go and spend 14 months putting that story together. So if you want to go and cite Michael Bloomberg's reporter.
Right, and they say that you're also funded a lot of your research by the NRA. But anyway, we won't get into that. It's just to say that some of your statistics are debated. They are debated. We'll leave it at that. Alan, I could see you kind of rolling your eyes a bit, and I wanted to get your thoughts on what you heard.
It's quite tough for me to believe that in this country where we have so many mass shootings and individual shootings, that the idea that more guns available will make people safer. I don't see that relationship at all, frankly. And I think what we've seen is that there's no part of society as a whole that's safe. Gun violence is the leading cause of death among children. You have seniors that are being impacted. You have education institutions, religious institutions. There's no place that feels completely safe at all, with so many guns that are unregulated. You have states with different background checks. You have red flag laws that are not catching or stopping people or being implemented. And it was only until 3 or 4 years ago that the CDC was allowed to even study the issue of gun violence. I think overall we have a sense of fear in this country of the other, fear of things or people we don't like. And with this consistent tool of violence, the gun, particularly the assault rifles that are out there, you have a way to exercise that fear. And so what I see is bloodshed across many communities, across many cities and states, and no systemic change and action coming, and particularly failure from leaders, both in some state governments and at Congress, to be serious about the issue and take a stand to do something different. And the result is violence on an almost day-to-day basis that is unseen anywhere else in the world.
Okay.
It's unacceptable.
Larry, let me get you into this conversation because you believe actually in a level of gun control. So you've said actually we need to check mental health, for example, before sales. But let me clarify something, because what's disturbing about that, and I need to get your take on this, is you're saying effectively someone that might suffer from depression or even schizophrenia shouldn't have the same constitutional rights as others. They don't have the right to defend and protect themselves via the Second Amendment and their right to bear arms.
That's right. That Second Amendment says that you have the right to bear arms. But the question, Andrea, is what's a reasonable right to bear an arm? And what I've tried to suggest is that there are a few thresholds that we should go through before you purchase a gun. One is that you should apply for a permit. There's an idea. Second is that we should make sure in society that you don't have any violent past history, that you've had no criminal history, such as aggravated assault, intimate partner violence, etc. And the third is that you should be evaluated for mental health to make sure that the person is not angry at someone, has a grievance against an employer, may have schizophrenia, could have some serious, and by the way, schizophrenia is not a mental illness, it's a brain disorder, but to make sure that the person is seeking a weapon for reasonable cause. What's happened is that the gun lobby is winning. They're winning slowly, surely, they're winning incrementally by arguing that you have the right to bear. Is the right to bear arms, does that include a magazine? Does that include automatic, semi-automatic? And folks like John are going to say, well, you know, an automatic is not a semi-automatic, and they get into how many clips. The whole point is, what is the reasonable standard for a person to own a gun? And I believe you have the right to own a gun. But should you have 40 guns, 80 guns? Should you have automatic rifles in your... And how do we know whether a person is capable? We have no common ground.
We don't. But again, I mean, this is what's so almost absurd about it, is somebody who does suffer from a mental illness, again, they may have never committed a crime in their life, and they are an American citizen who has the same right to enjoy the freedoms that they say the Second Amendment has. That's why
people often act on impulse, Andrea. That's one of the issues. People act on impulse to
right, but just
rob a
because somebody
convenience store.
hasn't been, you know, diagnosed with a mental illness doesn't mean they won't have those impulses. And they've also tried the 72-hour. I'm sorry, the name escapes me now, but there was a law so that you couldn't buy a gun immediately just in case you could have committed a crime of passion within an immediate period of time. That also somehow didn't hold up in certain courts. So, but let me go back to John, because I want to talk a little bit more about the Second Amendment. You know, the Second Amendment clarifies, John, the right to bear arms as a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. But now it is all private ownership, and that private ownership is effectively threatening everyone's security. So how do you reconcile that?
I don't make Second Amendment arguments. It's never been something that's been of interest to me. What I've always tried to argue is what makes people safe, and that police are extremely important, but that the police themselves know that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. And the question is, what should people do when they're having to confront a criminal by themselves? And having a gun, particularly for people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly, and particularly for those who are most likely victims of violent crime, overwhelmingly poor blacks who live in high crime urban areas, having a gun is by far the most effective way for them to go and defend themselves when they're having to face a criminal. Those are the types of arguments that I make.
Should people have to, John, should people have to go through training? Should they have to go through a training course? You just made an argument that a poor person in an urban neighborhood needs to defend themselves. I'll agree with that. But should they have to go through any kind of training? Or, as I can tomorrow, I could go today into a store, buy a gun. I can go into a flea market. I don't have to be registered. Should people have to go through any kind of training program to know how to use that weapon effectively?
Look, I have no problem with background checks. The problem, and what you
That's
find—
not my question. My question is training, not a background check. Should they have to go through training to know how to use the weapon that they just purchased for $150?
It was part of your question because you were talking about flea markets and what have you, okay? But with regard to the training, look, we have lots of data, okay? We have states that require training for people to get a concealed handgun permit, and most of them don't require you to have a training now. But we can go and see what happens. Do people lose permits at different rates in those places? And you don't find that they do. The rate that people get into trouble is no different in those two types of states. And the question is why? And that is, when you're talking about law-abiding individuals, they know that they have a lot to lose. And what they do is they get training on their own. The problem that you have with many government-imposed training rules is that they have you do a lot of useless things that aren't very useful. When people go and get training when it's not something that's mandated, what you find is that the training is much more set up for things that are useful for people to be able to go and learn. But, you know, I say, go look at the data. If you can show me that when you look across concealed carry states, that the ones that don't require training have higher rates of problems, then we can have something to talk about. But
you know what,
John,
go ahead, Ellen.
I think one of one of the areas where I would push back is that I think we have an unregulated gun problem overall. And so it becomes a bit hard, as I live in Chicago, Illinois, where there's many strong gun control measures in the state. I'm surrounded by states that don't have those same regulations in place. As you know, people can move back and forth between states, and the tracking and licensing and permitting is not something that's consistent. You have people that legally purchase guns, but we know that they're not being secured in the ways that they need. And I guess I sit here looking at questions about the Second Amendment. I look at questions about more security in schools and in churches, which seems almost antithetical to the places where people gather within their community. And these all seem like good things to investigate in, but it doesn't change that the core issue is whether you're in a state with a lot of gun control or you're in a state with no gun control measures, we have unregulated flooding of guns, particularly the ease of purchasing high-powered assault rifle type weapons, and we see them repeatedly being used to go and hurt others. And the idea that we're not going to respond to that reality, a uniquely American reality on a nearly day-to-day basis is in many ways, if I think about the Constitution and political leaders, it is an abdication of their responsibility to protect people across this country, and to respond with inaction or there's nothing we can do about it seems incredibly heartless and irrational fundamentally to what the problem is and possible solutions, because the status quo is not working.
John, I'll let you respond very quickly, please.
I want to do something that matters. The problem is that the types of gun control laws that keep on being put forward are ones that we know won't matter. You look at background checks on the private transfers of guns. Name me, and it gets brought up all the time, name me one mass public shooting this century that would have been stopped as a result of having such a law in effect. There's not one. It'd be great if there was something simple like that that would be able to go and work.
John,
You talk about assault weapons. I don't think you have a clue. Look, an AR-15, okay, is a semi-automatic assault rifle, okay? It's identical to a small caliber semi-automatic hunting rifle. Why do you want to go?
Here we go again with the argument. Hold on, John. Here we go again with, and remember, I believe in the Second Amendment. But here we go again with an expert like yourself making a comment that most people cannot relate to. Here's the reality. 330 million Americans, but we own 396 million guns of all kinds, semi-automatic, automatic, handguns. The whole point is we have too many guns. We've got to figure it out as a country. And you're a rational guy. I think you have to find a way, and we have to find a way in society to say, how many guns do we need? What's the threshold to purchase a gun? But it should not be a case as the following, that I can go and literally it takes more time to register my car and buy an automobile and to buy a gun, to have it on my person. This is insane. We've got to find a way to come back to a reasonable ownership of guns. Not control of all guns, but a reasonable ownership standard.
John, I'd like you to actually address this if you can. I mean, I need to move on to another area of this debate because it is very important. I mean, you believe more guns will make more people safe, but what about the trauma people face being victims of shootings, witnesses to shootings? If you're the good guy that shot and killed the bad guy with the gun, you have the trauma of having killed another human being. And now you're asking, teachers, for example, to be armed. They don't want to be armed because they don't want to have to be in the position to kill another human being, period. How do you reconcile the trauma that can be associated with gun ownership and having to kill another person or witness it?
Well, look, we have 20 states that have armed teachers and staff. We have literally thousands of schools. There has not been one attack where anybody's been wounded or killed in a school that's allowed teachers and staff to carry. All the attacks, every single one, when anybody's been wounded or killed, has occurred in those schools where teachers and staff aren't allowed to go and carry. So if you want to eliminate these attacks, but look, crime, violent crime with guns, okay, people use guns defensively 5 times more frequently each year to stop violent crime than crime is used committing guns. But if I could go and click my fingers and cause all guns in the United States to disappear and all guns, how long do you think the vast majority of purchases of illegal guns come from drug dealers? They have guns to go and protect their very valuable property. How long do you think if I could click my fingers and cause the guns to disappear before illegal drugs started coming back into the country and drug gangs?
Okay, but then again, we're back to the question of why is this a uniquely American problem? Other countries, it is. No other country on the planet has this level of gun, developed country in particular. Okay, let me go to Alan though quickly because this is interesting. Poll after poll has.
Murder rate 6 times higher than the United States.
As I said, if people want to see your statistics, they're all over the internet. But hold on. I mean, Alan, poll after poll, as I was saying, have said a majority of Americans favor gun control. But it actually doesn't really matter what a majority of Americans want. If the U.S. Senate, for example, and the Supreme Court do not represent that majority. I mean, for example, so that our audience understands, you have the state of South Dakota with less than 1 million people getting the same 2 senators as California with almost 40 million people. So is there ever a way that legislation that apparently the majority of Americans would like to see will ever really get passed?
It's very difficult, and I think that's part of the heartbreak of the cycle that we're living within. One of the things that needs to happen, as strong as many pro-gun lobby, many pro-Second Amendment lobbyists are, there needs to be a balance by the American voter. And honestly, there is a cycle where there's outrage, there's trauma, there's hurt, but this issue as a primary issue when it comes to primary elections and general elections, at the end of the day, does not stay at the top of one's minds. And so it's important to note about the polling that you mentioned. You have Democrats and Republicans in the general public that support common sense background checks, gun regulation, to not taking everyone's guns away, but making sure that people have training, that there's systems in place, that the legal buying age is 21, and those types of common sense measures. You have agreement around from gun owners and non-gun owners about many of these measures. And so for me, I think the next step is, how do you sustain, I appreciate you, John, how do you sustain the momentum around this as an issue that is top of mind for people? And the fact that we even have to talk about regular gun violence. Every other day, a mass shooting in this country, uniquely this country, almost 20 school shootings in this country. That issue fades from people's minds is, I think, a real devastating consequence of the frequency and the normalization of this.
Yeah, that is going to have to be the final word. The clock is just against us. I'd like to thank really all three of my panelists so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Be sure to subscribe to our Twitter page and our YouTube channel. We'll see you next time. I'm Andrea Sankey. Thanks for joining us.